But you point out the distance from the building at which some of these jumpers are. And they might not be able to be that distance if they were jumping.
Yeah, like the world record for standing broad jump in the Olympics in 1908 maybe it was. That seems like a pretty good example of the type of footwear. Now they wear special footwear and warm up and whatnot, but back then a standing broad jump. Back then, that seems like it's a reasonable amount, but these people would have to be able to launch out of a window with that kind of oomph.
What about some of the people that, it's really a touchy, sensitive subject, but some of the people standing...
That was a very difficult chapter to write because I didn't want to turn into a blood and guts chapter.
It's also a very difficult chapter to read and look at the pictures at the same time, but you're forcing us to look at the facts. Some of the people seem to be taking off their clothes at the windows. Why?
Right. There were some that were obviously without pants and some were obviously without shirts, hanging out the windows. And the one that got to me the most is the one who appears to be hanging from one hand and one foot, dangling there, taking off his pants. And that's the 105th floor.
Why would people be doing that in such a precarious position? What would tell them to do that?
I can only, obviously there's some reason that they would need to take the pants off outside the building, not inside. And so, I think of putting myself in that situation. And like Elaine Gentle, who went to the bathroom and got a towel wet and wrapped around her head, my first instinct would be to run to the bathroom before we lost water pressure, wet down my spare clothes I had at my desk, and then, wrap my head with it, and then, bolt for the door and try to get out.
As I recall, you mentioned something about how clothing is affected.
If you're wet from, wrapping yourself up in wet material, thinking that's going to help you against a fire, you'd be wet. And if the fire sprinklers came on, you'd be wet. And if it was hot in there and no fire sprinklers came on, you'd be sweating and you'd be wet. So it's a good chance you'd be wet. But also, you think of polyester clothing. I don't know what that does in different environments. But if there's something unique of that environment that made wet clothing unbearable.
What would have made wet clothing unbearable?
Well, this is just an example. This isn't proof of what happened. This is just a parallel example. You think of crowd control with active denial system.
Right.
And that, breaks up crowds by shooting microwaves at them. They can't it's just too painful. They have to, jump out of the way. And the only experience we each have with that type of thing is if you put your hand on the burner of a stove, you don't stop and say, maybe I should take my hand off the burner. No, by reflex, your hand flies off that burner.
Right.
If there's something in the environment, like microwave or some type of energy field that affects wet clothing differently than dry clothing, you'd be wanting to be out the window taking your wet clothes off.
Was this for you, Dr. Wood, the first hint that something other than bombs or explosives were involved in this? There might have been was this the first hint of maybe some kind of energy weapon?
Well, the first hint was that you don't have much rubble left. There's not much material left. Instead of the atoms being attracted to each other, it appears that they're repelling each other.
In chapter 6, you talk about the seismic impact. That was truly, truly interesting because there is an article that you quote from the New York Times talking about the weight of these buildings. Expand on that.
Don't remember exactly which one you're talking about, but yeah, each building is about 500,000 tons. It's 500,000 tons, not pounds, tons. 500,000 tons each. And there was no S wave or P wave.
What
detected
is an S
any
wave or a
events.
P wave?
They're in a seismic event, like an earthquake. You first get a P wave, a pulse wave, primary wave that arrives at the seismic station first, and then shortly after that you get the S wave, secondary wave or shear wave that arrives there. And based on the lag time and you knowing the material properties of the Earth, you can say how far away the epicenter was of that event. And I think most people have heard of that because those two waves travel through the Earth but travel at different speeds through the Earth. So one is slowed down more than the other one. And then there's a surface wave that also arrives, and based on the surface wave, they calculate the equivalent Richter scale reading, or the Richter scale reading for that. But
and
for all the
the Richter scale reading in this case was negligible, was it?
well, it was essentially negligible for building 6. It was a 0.6, and building 7 is 6 times the potential energy of the Seattle King Dome that was blown up, and that made a 2.3 on the Richter scale. And in building 7 only made a 0.6. Now each of the towers was approximately 30 times, that's 3 times 10, 30 times the potential energy of the King Dome, but one made a 2.3 and one made a 2.1 on the Richter scale. That's equivalent to everything turning to dust above the 20th floor and dropping only the bottom 16 or 20 stories, of that footprint to the ground to make a surface wave of that magnitude. But there was still no S wave or P wave detected.
The New York Times article that you reference in your book says it's a million tons of rubble, and then at the very end of this article, which sort of disappears, said what happened to the rubble. And also, evidently, there wasn't a lot of sound when the buildings came down.
Right, there's well, let me read one of the quotes of a emergency medical technician, Michael Ober. It's on page 71. He said, "I don't remember the sound of the building hitting the ground. Somebody told me that it was measured on the Richter scale. I don't know how true that is. If the building is hitting the ground that hard, how do I not remember the sound of it?"
Wow, that's stunning. And your book is filled with these unbelievable quotes from people who were right there.
I wondered right that day where's all the building gone, and then about 25 hours after the event, oh good, we now have some people asking about that. We had Peter Jennings in the studio and George Stephanopoulos at the site. Now Peter Jennings asked George Stephanopoulos, "George, Jackie Judd and many others have been asking, where'd all the rubble go?" And George says, "Well, I've been asking people that, and one volunteer, Robert Gerlinski, explained it all fell down into the ground, was pulverized, evaporated."
Well, the first folks...
And just imagine, this is a newscaster who's there to tell people what happened, and that's the best he can do.
Well, there were some people initially who began to question. I mean, Hunter Thompson, the great gonzo journalist, the next day was on Australian radio, and he was saying this had to be an inside job. Now, we're not going to get into that, but...
here, saying it's an inside job, that's saying who did it before you know what it was that was done.
That's exactly right. So, now, some of those who began to question it, Dr. Wood, said, well, it looked like it was a controlled demolition. We see them all the time in buildings, controlled demolitions. But your book and that chapter just brilliantly refutes that. But then those who might argue with you would say, well, how do you explain those squibs of smoke that come bursting out of the side, which we can all see in photographs?
The squirts, I call them. There should have been a whole lot more if it was controlled demolition. A whole lot more. If you were going to squash that building down into its footprint in 8 seconds, or let's say 9.5 seconds, let's use that time. That's slower than free fall of the gravity speed. By the time you get to the bottom, just the average speed of the air squirting out there is like almost Mach 2.
Wow.
Out of each open orifice of the building, if every single window were open, that material is an awful lot of stuff in there. It's got to squirt out. So every single building around the perimeter, all the adjacent buildings should look machine gun fired.
Well, those folks who then bypass the business of controlled demolition say there are many nukes, and I hate to bring this up because this is a dog story in your book, but tell me about...
They say that they removed all the bomb sniffing dogs. Well, there's a dog that was in the building when it blew up. When it dustified or whatever, during the building's demise, and the dog was killed in the building. So how do you then say there were no dogs? His name was Sirius.
The other thing that you point out very tellingly is that nukes explode.
Yeah, and there's something else about them too.
What's that?
Let's see if I can. I was trying to see if I can play it here for you. Blinded by the light. Remember that from Manfred Mann, Earth Band? You think of a piece of evidence that was missing on 9/11. Who was blinded by the light? Nobody was blinded by light.
No, not at all.
Hot things glow. Nukes that are really hot, you're going to have all sorts of bright light, and you're going to have all sorts of heat. But you had 14 people trapped at the base of Stairway B. The picture on the cover of my book, they were in Stairway B when that picture was taken.
Oh, my.
And yet they walked out on their own.
Well, the next thing that some of these people who are trying to say that they came down mysteriously and not by planes, they talked about thermite. And
again, where's the blinding light?
And thermite,
you have to look at first determining what was the destructive mechanism. We can rule out high heat. The buildings did not cook to death. The things did not burn up. The surrounding environment, paper didn't burn, trees didn't burn. People walked out of there. People were, run over by the dust cloud rolling down the street. They were just left covered with dust. They didn't burn up. Matter of fact, they said the initial temperature of the dust cloud was cooler than ambient temperature.
And you point out the number of toilets in the building, none was found?
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence of any, or anything else.
3,000 toilets disappear, and there's only one filing cabinet left. Now, Chapter 8 is dustification. That material and the pictures are absolutely spellbinding, and they all speak for themselves. How did you come to that conclusion, and where did you get that phrase?
Well, being in the profession I was in, forensic engineering and science is my area of expertise. 40 years of experience in that, and being able to see. That's what I mean by experience being important to have, to be able to understand, to see what is there, not what you believe is there or what you think should be there. Is to be able to have a lot of discipline to just see what's there. And one of the things I would do in my regular work is, before I know what a phenomenon is, I give it a name, or I name my various specimens of a certain type. I call, there's one specimen, my favorite one, I call pothole, because when I polished the edge, it had these dips in it, and I had to figure out what those dips were from. But instead of immediately jumping to a name of a known phenomenon, I use these placeholders. And if you don't know what's happening with the building turning into dust in midair, it needs something to refer to it by, because if you call it vaporization, you're wrong. That implies high heat.
Oh.
If you say it's pulverization,